Just hit a button, Morty. Give me a beat.
Oh man, okay, all right.
Free my soul, just let it go. I wanna roam on my own, just let it go. Free my soul, just let it go. I cause a storm when I'm at home, just let it go.
Sipping in the sea, I don't know what this means. Spilling liquor all over my jeans. Who would've known I'd be battling a fiend? Is this my fate in this hip-hop scene? High like a kite, but I'm down on my knees. Battling enemies of my nightmare dreams. Open my eyes as I stare at screens. Hoping my lies are believed by machines. Knowing my crowds are playback scenes. No one feeling that pain that proceeds. Killing or murder don't make me better. Teenage mutant, I'm more like Shredder. G's in my pocket, I call that cheddar. 9 on my waist, I call a go-getter. I cut the string.
All right, welcome back to the series, The Wide World of Real Estate. Today, we're going to talk about zoning and encumbrances and how these suckers affect real estate values, which they certainly do. So before we get started, if you haven't, please do me a favor. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell for notifications of future videos in this series and others. I would really appreciate it. This channel is dedicated to everything that has to do with a house. So home building, remodel, DIY work, carpentry. Obviously, we're talking about real estate today, so it talks about real estate as well. If you haven't, make sure you subscribe. We've got plenty of awesome material in here and also on our podcast. So hit that like button before you guys forget. I appreciate it. And let's get right into what's going on with the zoning and encumbrances. All right, so first of all, we have to understand what the purpose of zoning is in the real estate world. That's what we're going to dive into now. All right. The purpose of zoning laws. So to segregate land uses that are thought to be incompatible with other uses, and it's also to prevent new developments from harming existing businesses or residences. Okay. Zoning is commonly regulated through local government and municipalities. It really is just to dictate what can be built in a certain area of a certain town, if that makes a whole lot of sense. All right. Usually, and most often around this country at least, zoning is regulated through local counties and municipalities. And it's not the building department. It's going to be the other areas of the local government that you're looking at, okay? So really, it's just to help businesses kind of decide where they're going to be built and residences where they're going to be built. So it sort of does a split between commercial, residential. It also helps divide up where schools are going to go, and it basically dictates how basically a plot plan is going to be developed. Those regulations kind of help everybody from getting in harm's way of each other, all right? There are restrictions from zoning, obviously, because that's what the purpose of zoning is to do, is to what it dictates what can be built in a certain area, like I said, and what can't, okay? So the first restriction is going to be on use, and that's really basically just dictated by residential versus commercial versus industrial uses, agricultural, open space where you can't build anything at all, leave the land alone kind of deal. There's also density restrictions. So examples like high density uses of multi-story, like high rises, apartment buildings, office buildings, how many stories, how many floors, so forth. Even how many houses can be built on certain sizes of lots, okay? There's also height restrictions of buildings and square footage restrictions. So zoning can dictate how big a building can be or a structure can be, and also how tall. Throughout the different building departments here in Colorado, we have different municipalities that actually will be dictated on height through a bulk plane, which is another restriction that's put on kind of to dictate how high a building can be made or added onto. And that all helps kind of regulate that restriction on zoning as well. That's just one example of it, was bulk plane. All right, so the location of the structure relative to the lot lines themselves. So every lot has a boundary, just like every state has a boundary, every country has a boundary. It's a border that is shown where that lot is going to go. So relative to that is regulation that dictates how far away from the front of the lot, the back of the lot, and the side of the lot you can build a building. And that's going to be dictated by the zoning regulations within that local area, okay? So every municipality will have different regulations and zoning codes to tell you how you can build that, all right? There's also restrictions on the amount of landscaped space a lot is required to have. Commercially, you may have to do more landscaping than residentially, but you have to have a certain ratio of landscaping on the lot. And that's not just saying we're putting in grass somewhere or whatever. There's dictation on landscape, xeriscape, flat works, or as far as patios, sidewalks, how many trees need to be put in a certain area. That's all dictated by zoning as well. All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about are encumbrances. And this is the other effect that can kind of drive real estate values, okay? So what are encumbrances? Encumbrances are basically an interest or a right a person has on another person's property. These are non-possessory. So that means that it doesn't give you the right to have possession of the property, okay? Examples of that, what would non-possessory be? Well, liens, all types of liens, mechanics liens. The most typical lien you're going to look at is going to be a mortgage. That is actually a lien on the property. You owe money on the property till it's paid off, which means the lender has a lien and a right to your property if you don't pay them. Those are the most common types of encumbrances. There's also deed restrictions, which we'll brief on here in just a second. So, like I said, there's monetary claims against the property for liens. Like I said, mechanics liens. You got property tax liens. There's special assessment types of liens that can be made. There's also court action placed on a property that can be a lien. Okay, those are all different types of encumbrances that can be thrown on a property. So a general lien, from financial reasons, would attach from the debtor's property. Another reason, or another way you could look at this is general lien would be like including judgment liens and IRS tax liens. They affect the title to real property, and you can place what's called a cloud on the title. And it has to be, so this, if that happens, you have to satisfy this so the owner can provide clear title in the case where you would be transferring the property, i.e. selling the property. And this is where it can actually affect the sale or the value of the property. If there are liens against the property and it's listed for a certain price, those liens have to be satisfied before you can sell the property. That's what the purpose of the lien is to keep someone from avoiding paying these liens if they're financial, or avoid satisfying the lien in other ways if they're non-financial, before they can collect any money on their property and transfer title. And this will all show up on title work during contract period, if you guys understand that. So once your property is under contract, you go through a title commitment, and that title company runs through everything that's on the property, including the zoning and the encumbrances. And if these liens pop up, those need to be paid off. Most common, like I said, would be a mortgage. Obviously, that gets paid off at time of closing. If the seller is upside down on the property, then that seller would actually have to bring money to the table to pay it off. But that has to be satisfied before you can sell the property, okay? Deed restrictions. Deed restrictions can place a limit on the use of the property. They're also known as, what you guys have heard, as like covenants or conditions. So deed restrictions are most common when construction subdivisions are built, new homes, basically in production home sites. So builders, developers, they place restrictions on the deed for the purpose of maintaining standards for the use of the property within that development. And there's lots of types of these deed restrictions. Examples. You have no recreational vehicles are allowed to park in the development, such as RVs and so forth. They have deed restrictions on the height of fences in the development, or even the type of fence that you can put in. Restrictions on commercial vehicle parking in the development. So if you own a business and you run it out of your home, you may not be able to park your commercial vehicle, which will be dictated by the bylaws and covenants of that development as to what a commercial vehicle means. Usually it has to be over a certain weight, and there's a description as to what dictates a commercial vehicle. Non-domestic animals being allowed in the development, chickens, cows, goats, sheep, so forth. You may or may not be able to have those types of animals based on a deed restriction. No outbuildings greater than a certain size, like sheds over 120 square feet, will not be allowed to be built in your development on your property. Those are all deed restrictions, okay? So those can all have an effect on the market value of a home as well. All right. Zoning regulations versus zoning ordinances. We're going to talk about the two differences of these because they also have a profound effect on real estate values. So, regulations, let's start with that first, okay? Regulations are all uses, okay? So, uses, as we talked about briefly before, residential versus commercial versus agricultural and industrial. Those are all different uses. There's also multi-use or mixed use, which is you've seen developments where they have retail on the first floor, and then above this building, there's apartments and condos that are built above it. So those are mixed-use types of uses that are allowed per zoning regulations in a certain area, okay? Zoning ordinances are basically the restrictions that are regulating what can be built, such as we talked before, building height, the shape and size of a building, okay? Setback regulations. So like we said, how far the building can be set back from the street, how far from the side borders or boundaries of that lot they can be set. There's minimum and maximums. Usually there's a minimum on side setbacks. And there's also buffers. So that's basically anything we're talking about here as far as requirements for open and undeveloped areas. Boy, I can't talk today, guys. Sorry. Those are all buffers, okay? And those are all under the ordinance of zoning. There certainly can be exceptions to the zoning ordinances, which would be things like variances. Okay? Variances are when you go into the building department and you request a change to the zoning ordinance itself so you can build an exception to what's already being stated, i.e. build up higher than would be allowed otherwise, build closer to the side or rear and front setbacks if you're doing an addition to a home, so forth. Those are variances. There's also non-conforming uses that can be exceptions, things that would not otherwise be allowed, okay? Non-conforming use permits, that's usually when you... when a property is being used for a particular purpose prior to the zoning or prior to a zoning change. Usually non-conforming use permits would contain certain restrictions for the property owner. For example, the time in which you have to conform to the new zoning, up to like 12 years. They'll dictate how much time you have to change. So you're non-conforming until that change is in effect. Prohibition of rebuilding the property if it's destroyed, prohibition of enlarging the structure, as I talked about, prohibition of continuance of the permits if the building is abandoned. Those are all non-conforming uses that can be changed. Rezoning is if you go through a variance and you change the zoning, even from residential to commercial use, if things are changing in the neighborhood, developers come in, they need to rezone property in order to build a mixed-use building, for instance, as opposed to a single-family home. There's also conditional uses. Those are, types of uses where you can be allowed a one-time change, or you're being allowed a mixed-use kind of area when it wouldn't be allowed otherwise, and that's for a duration of time most likely. Okay, so those are conditional uses and another exception to an ordinance. Those all have a fairly good effect on the value of real estate, as you can see. Changes that you can or cannot make. If someone's, for instance, wanting to buy a home because they want to do a giant addition or an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit off the back of the property, and zoning currently doesn't allow that, there is a lot of foot and legwork on their end in order to try and get that changed as far as zoning goes. Or they're buying it for, wanting to build a little strip mall in this area, and they want to rezone the property. They may or may not be able to do that. And because of all that legwork that's going to be in brain damage, really, that's going to be put in effect, that can have a value on the property as far as what investors are looking at, as we talked about in the last video. Value versus, what the market's going to dictate. So if it's a bunch of investors looking at it in that respect, that actual, the listing price may have to come down because the market's dictating there's a lot of legwork to change it the way they want it. So that value is going to change. Those all obviously can have an effect on market value and market price. Okay. So those are basically, those are all the things that can play an effect on zoning and encumbrances to market value. So that wraps up this video on zoning and encumbrances and their effect on real estate market values. I appreciate you guys watching, stopping by. Again, make sure if you haven't hit that subscribe button, check out all the content on the channel, hit the like button on the way out, leave comments and questions for sure down below the description. I always enjoy reading those and try and get back to them as soon as I can. Tell your friends. The best thing you can do is share this video and this channel with others to help me grow and get more educational content out there in the world of home building and real estate. Again, I appreciate you guys. That is all. Later.